It seems nowadays, everywhere you look, there's a new narrative. For a lot of young people, and many parents have opted to allow their children to get the jab. Now, this probably doesn't get too much headlines. You may hear of it here and there, uh, but I do like to follow stuff like this, talking about for those who have opted to take it. It says at least 18 cases of apparent heart problems in young people in Connecticut after receiving the jab, and this is as of the 25th. And it goes on to say that at least 18 teens and young adults in Connecticut have shown symptoms of heart disease, of heart problems, after receiving their jab, says acting health commissioner Dr. Gifford said on Monday. Now, many of these individuals, actually all of these individuals, as it says here, required hospitalization. Now, these are young people who are 18 and younger showing signs of heart failure. Now, and if you're that young, typically young people are, of course, very resilient. And so many of these individuals can be hospitalized and they subsequently bounce back because of their youth, having a strong body, strong immune system. So for many of these young people, they can bounce back. But what about for the older ones who show signs of heart failure and maybe it doesn't get caught that the person is now showing these signs and symptoms of heart disease or of heart failure related to getting the jab, and it goes unnoticed, right? And of course, there was another teen here from Kenmore. It says Kenmore teen develops myocarditis after the second jab. CDC investigating possible rare side effect, right? And so it's always, the picture is always painted as these things are just like, who knows if it's going to happen? The chances are so small. Why are we even having this conversation? But they don't have that conversation when it was related to actually being symptomatic for the disease. Now, of course, there's always ways to manipulate how this all kind of works out. Article here from The Hedge, and I've talked about this numerous times. Right? Article here on The Hedge says caught red-handed, CDC changes test thresholds to virtually eliminate new bug cases among the vax. And I talked about this in a previous video, that the CDC said that they were no longer going to be counting cases if you had already received the poke, right? And so, of course, that's a way to artificially lower the numbers, right? They weren't doing that back then, right? So they were like, well, if you don't come into the hospital, if you don't die, those are basically the two parameters. Either you end up in the hospital and you're symptomatic for the disease, or you died as a relation to the disease. Then they'll say, all right, fine. Now we're going to count you. They weren't doing that last year under the previous administration. And as you can see, there's a lot of manipulation, and it's not just in relation to this, but into many other things that we're going to discuss, right? So you can check out this article. Of course, they refer to these things as breakthrough infection. It's kind of as a way season the discussion, right? So they already know that some people might die as a result of taking the poke. Some people might still get it. And so they kind of season the news so that people, when people hear this stuff, they're just like, well, they said it was going to happen. But that's not what we're discussing. What we're referring to is, why didn't they take a very similar stance previously? And we know why that is the case. And stuff like this, you really don't hear too much about. This is a young woman here, is a young model coming out of, I believe, the UK. And it says, the final words of model Stephanie Dubois reveals she felt horrendous and showed bruised arms in last post before dying of the jab. And it says British model Stephanie Dubois revealed she felt horrendous and showed her bruised arms in one of the last posts before she died after receiving her poke. So she was 39 years old, had a serious thrombotic, right, another word for blood clot episode, and a very rare blood clots after being given the AstraZeneca, right? And that was the one that America gave to India, right? So there was all this big hubbub, India is on the verge of collapse, people dying in the streets, they're burning them, they're burning people in the streets, right? That was the narrative, of course, of why they were trying to get many individuals to take the poke. They were like, their variant is worse than ours, right? They did the same thing with UK, Very similar what happened in Africa. There was big hubbub about the Africa variant, and then the Africa variant went over into the UK, and they were like, UK experiencing mass deaths, and then of course all that narrative disappeared. Very similarly with what's going on in UK, there's been numerous in India. There's been numerous videos from actually people who live in India talking about your media is lying to you, and that should not surprise you. It should not surprise you. It's not that they're just like, well, maybe didn't have all the facts, or a little sensation here. Little, what do they call it? What's the word I'm looking for? Sensualization, right? A little hyperbole. Not too bad. No, they're literally outright lying to people, to the Americans, and it's for the purpose of manipulating your mind. I talked about this in relation to inflation. Everything you hear is inflation, 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 right? They're even saying Americans are Googling inflation more times than ever before. And of course, every single day, Powell gets on TV and is like, well, we really don't see inflation, but they do see price rises. Now, of course, the narrative, yes, that there has been some excess printing. You may hear of your favorite YouTuber talking about this, but overwhelmingly the money doesn't leave the system, right? So if you take, let's just say, out of all the money that there is printed, you double it, right? If there was, let's just say, 5 trillion total dollars globally, and then the Fed just decides to up and double the number, whatever, for whatever reason, we're going to double that number, but then they take all of that money that they just printed, right, or in essence digitally created, and then they shove it in the banking system and no one ever sees it. Does that have an impact on the system? No, it doesn't. The only way that the inflation that people should be worried about is when the country actually is on the verge of collapse and people are like, I don't know if we want to keep your currency because we don't know if you're going to have business tomorrow, right? If you have a business, you say you go, it's a clothing store, right? Or maybe it's a place that they do laundry, and on the side it says going out of business. You might think twice about dropping off your laundry because the next time you come back, you might not be able to get your laundry. So you think twice about doing business with them. And that's when Americans need to worry about whether or not there's going to be inflation. Hyperinflation is what people were referring to. And like, Americans are going to be starving, right? This is the narrative. This is the narrative that they want to pump out to individuals, right? We've seen it in the housing, right? We've seen it in housing where they talk about the price of lumber. Price of lumber is skyrocketing and the houses are going up left and right. But what they don't tell you is that people are also hoarding a lot of lumber. There's been videos showcasing this very thing where people drive by to some of these lumber mills where they say there is a shortage or they're out, and they see lumber as far as they can see. It's because many of these individuals know the game that the government is playing, and they're like, shoot, why don't we play right along? Why don't we hold off on selling our lumber because we know the narrative is inflation and we can get a better price. So why don't we just hold on? Maybe we'll break a little bit off, right? Oh, we're really short, right? Here's 5 pieces of lumber. That's all I got. Come back next month. The price is going to be different. That's the game people are playing. Now, of course, a lot of it is related to supply chain constraints. But a lot of it is related to manipulation. How many people, what was it, the Suez Canal, right? A lot of that is just, where did that go? No one ever found out what was going on. How did that happen? All randomly. It's all manipulation. So what we're seeing is not inflation, at least not the inflation that Americans should be worried about. Is the economy on the verge of collapse? Should Americans be worried? But what we are seeing is price manipulation to an extent never seen before. Because it's so blatant, and because it's so blatant, many Americans don't understand what's going on. Now, in terms of what is related to the bug, stuff like this does happen, right? Where we see some businesses are just like, you know what, we're just trying to get back to business as best as possible. Chicago restaurant separates those who got the poke from those who didn't get the poke. And so there's a lot of narratives, not just one narrative. There might be a goal at the end. But there is not just one narrative. There's multiple narratives with a goal in mind, right? And so stuff like this you have to keep in mind, right? And so someone, of course, posted this. This is an email that came out and it was just to all those in social media platforms, right? There is no such thing as the Indian variant, right? This Government of India Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology and Electronics. This came out on the 21st of this month. And of course, it says to all social media, says this invites the reference to the advisory dated on the 20th and on the 7th, issued by the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, Government of India, regarding curbing of false news and misinformation concerning the virus on social media platforms. It has come to our knowledge that a statement is being circulated online which implies that there is an Indian variant in relation to the disease. And of course, they bold, this is completely false. There is no such variant. And then the same, very similarly, when I was reading about in Africa, this exact same thing happened there. If you weren't reading about what was going on in Africa or the Africa variant, you would have realized that it was literally a nothing burger. But then the news comes out of the Africa variant making its way into the UK and people are dropping left and right. But if you paid attention to what was going on in Africa, there was literally nothing going on in Africa. They proposed at best that there were about 60,000 cases out of the 1.1, 1.3 billion people that live in Africa. 60K is nothing. And of course, they don't have a great system in terms of testing individuals, but what they were basing that on was excess deaths. And they really didn't see a lot of excess deaths. Excess deaths, of course, have been manipulated in different countries, but in places like Africa where they have no agenda, there's no reason for them to do that. But in places like in America and in other regions, they do. This is a bigger game that is going on more in the world. And so for those people who are like, well, why didn't, if this was going to happen, why didn't the government know? The reality is that they did. They do know that there is a chance that young people can experience heart-related issues. It came out in Israel. And I said, pay attention to Israel. I always told you, pay attention to what is going on in Israel. Israel is the poster boy of what is going on in terms of facts, in terms of the poke, getting the jab, etc. Right? In terms of a lot of the narrative comes from what's going on in Israel. And so you shouldn't be surprised that Israel is going, there is a conflict going on within Israel, right? It says Israel examining heart inflammation cases in people who receive the Pfizer. You never hear anything negative about Pfizer, do you? Everything is about the AstraZeneca. They're real quiet when it comes to this one. And it goes on to say, and this is coming out of the UK, Pfizer and the AstraZeneca vaccine, it says there's a probe going on in Europe after reports of heart inflammation and rare nerve disorders. I'm sure you haven't heard a lot about that, have you? Now, in relation to, we talked about tariffs and, in relation to lumber, we talked about supply chain constraints, right? And so if the government was really concerned about prices in lumber, well, then the question would be, well, why are they putting extra tariffs on Canadian lumber? There weren't tariffs last year when there was a bug going around and they were worried about the lumber because there was like a specific beetle that was eating up a lot of the trees. And so what they did was they cut them down and they treated them very quickly, and then they sent it all to America. This happened, I believe, in 2020 or 2019, one of those, I forget. And America didn't have any issue, but there was also no shortage going on. Shortage, right? And so the question is why are tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber hitting U.S. home buyers hard? If there really was a shortage, would America be doing this? If anything, America would be like, shoot, send it to us. We got a shortage. People want to buy houses. We need it. But that's not the narrative, right? So what you see is, at the very least, what they're referring to is not inflation, but manipulation. There's a lot of manipulation going on in America. And if you're not taking the time to educate yourself, and literally, like the Bible says, if you dig for it as if you're digging for gold, you will find it. If you're really looking for information about what's going on and how this is all going to play out, and of course, how to navigate your life and how to navigate your finances, you really have to dig for it, as the Bible says, as for gold. Because a lot of this information doesn't really get talked about. It might get talked about here and there, but not by comparison to what you hear on the mainstream media. And that's why most people say you shouldn't even watch the mainstream media, because it's literally just lies and propaganda.